Okay, so next, both Paul and I are going to give you a preview of the public hearing draft. And Paul's done this a couple of times. This is very similar to that preview in terms of most of the issues that are selected. But first, as we were just talking about, in terms of the schedule, we have made progress since we last met in terms of the pre-public hearing draft steps that we have to take internally before the administration gives us the okay to go take them to the Secretary of State's office for publication. So we've moved it out of our building. We have approval now from Executive Office of Environmental Affairs, and it's now with Administration and Finance, which is pretty much the last step before we'll be okay to publish it. So this schedule is all based on getting that final okay. At that point, it would be published in the Mass Register. We have to do some noticing to other agencies. That takes a couple of weeks. Schedule those public hearings. We think we'll be holding three or four public hearings. Let the comment period run for 2.5 to 3 months, which would span the time that we're also holding those hearings. So 2.5 to 3 months for review and submitting written comments. Then, depending on the number of comments and how long it takes us to get through them, that's usually a couple months process. At that point, doing our revisions before we publish the final regulation. So if you add that all up, it looks like we'd be working on and publishing that final draft in the fall. Couple of things about the effective date as it's drafted in the public hearing draft. We're proposing that the reportable concentrations would take effect on the day it's published, and this is how we've handled this in the past, and that the other provisions, there would be some lag time for effective date. But in terms of taking advantage of new standards, that we would publish those at the same time as Method 2 standards, which we have a provision in the MCP to do that, so they could be in effect at that point as well, and you really get the option to either finish up your site under the old standards or take advantage of the new standards during that time period. So that kind of helps with the transition. And also during those early days, preferably during that 2-month period before everything goes into effect, we'd be doing more outreach and training on the provisions, more detailed training, probably most likely a 4-hour training, so that people are more familiar with them before they go into effect. In terms of the, most of us that I see out here have been through this before, but just to explain, we publish 2 versions. We publish a clean version that incorporates all the changes, but really the one that is most useful to review is the redline version. That shows how it's changing from the current text. And with the redline version, we include right ahead of each set of changes notes to reviewers that explain what we thought the issue was, what our intent was in terms of making the change. Sometimes we ask specifically for questions. We pose some additional questions for people to think about in their response. So there are many, it's pretty detailed. Except for a few strictly editorial changes, we try to include a note to reviewer ahead of each one of the changes or sets of changes. So the draft has 97 notes to reviewers. The thing we've done this time, which I think is much better than I think 2014, is that we're publishing the entire MCP. So you can go back within this one document and look for cross-references or other issues that may be related. Last time we thought we were doing everyone a favor by publishing extracts. Wasn't very helpful. No.
Not as helpful.
No, it's not as helpful, and it's also not as useful to us when we have to go back and just make sure we haven't made a made some disconnect with something else that's in the MCP. So it's longer, but it will be hopefully much easier for you to review in that respect. In terms of written comments, this may be the last meeting we have before the draft is out.
We hope so.
So I just wanted to say a few things about written comments and what we find particularly useful. We like the teams that get together, and we also like the individual practitioners that give us comments as something relates to a particular site, and both things are very useful. Somebody might just want to submit a comment about one or two things as it relates to a site. In terms of commenting on it, if you agree with the intent but you don't like how it's written, please give us specific language as how something could be clarified. Sometimes people are neutral on it and they still will give us some specific language to improve it. That's very helpful. It's a little more helpful than saying, this aspect of it is wrong, but without kind of taking a stab at how to say that, because we may not fully interpret what you're telling us at that point. And you all, as people that do this work in the real world, can really help us in terms of thinking about it in terms of your current and past sites, and whether or not there are any issues that we haven't identified or we're kind of glossing over that really should be considered as part of the proposals. This is a list of topics we want to run through today. I'm going to cover those on the left hand, and Paul will come back to do the others. This is roughly the breakdown of also what we're going to be covering at training at the LSPA, and so if you want to come back and get additional preview, this time for 1.5 credits, LSPA is putting on a course at March 19th in Westboro, and now also April 16th in Springfield. Nancy Bettinger and I will be doing that. It will be expanded from what we're talking about today. Nancy will spend more time talking about exposure point concentrations and the risk assessment related provisions. We're also going to structure that so that we do a little bit of talking, and then we have set points in the presentation where people can ask questions. So that's another opportunity to get a slightly more detailed preview.
And at least on one of those, the regs are likely to be out.
Yeah, okay.
That's so funny.
Yeah, we have shied away from putting like actual language because until we get the big green light, and then also when we have actual language, we get much more difficult questions. So, but once it's out for public comment, then we can even get into more detail in terms of maybe how some of the things are written. The first set of items have to do with cross-program coordination type issues. One is there's some additional provisions added that relate to the notice of activity and use limitations at surplus sites. Those, as you recall, we included the ability to use notice of activity and use limitations at surplus sites in the 2014 regulations. Some additional provisions are to clarify which MCP provisions apply to those sites. There's also provisions that tell you what the corresponding surplus status is with respect to when a notice of activity use limitation may be used as part of a permanent solution and as part of remedy operation status. That's something else I will mention, that just generally across all activity and use limitations, we have revised the form and provisions to make it clear that they're also applicable at remedy operation status. That is something that went away for a while, and we've brought that back. There's also provisions up in 40.0020 about changes in use at the property and providing notice to DEP and EPA when you're taking additional steps to restore the site to make it suitable for change in use. Other program coordination, underground storage tank provisions, updating the references to the program since it's been moved over from fire services to our department and regulated under 310 CMR 80. We're taking some of the references like the tank tightness test results, and instead of having it in 2 sets of regs, we're just referencing back to their regs so that we won't create any discrepancies in the future. This is a new adequately regulated area in terms of radioactive material and coordinating our program with how sites are handled under the DPH radiation control program. And it really, there are some new definitions related to this as well, but a distinction is made between the licensed facilities, those that are already licensed by DPH, and non-licensed facilities. And the breakdown really is licensed facilities with only radioactive material would still be handled by the DPH radiation control program. Licensed facilities that have both radioactive material and other oil and hazardous material would be given an RTN for those other contaminants, but otherwise the radioactive material handled by the DPH program. And the non-licensed facilities would be handled as an MCP site with an RTN. But the approach that we would take under our program to the radioactive material would be equivalent in terms of risk management approach as the one used by DPH. So also a provision there that for those sites under the MCP, any radiation left behind that's above a background level would require an activity use supervision. Drinking water program, there are a couple. We were a little, initially in this group, looking at perhaps being a little more ambitious in terms of changes, but after discussions, we really landed on this set of changes in terms of making our definitions with respect to what our groundwater 1 areas consistent with the way the drinking water program looks at them. So 2 of the changes that are being made is one, to exclude areas from GW1 that are Zone A's of a Class A surface water body that are used for emergency supplies. That is also the way they're viewed under the drinking water program as not being protected to the level of an actual drinking water supply. And also to include in the non-potential drinking water source areas landfills and wastewater residual monofills, which is something in the drinking water program where they are criteria for not permitting a drinking water supply near those areas. This is a long incoming change, and I've heard from several people that they have sites just waiting to use this provision. I've heard from some other people that they didn't think this went far enough, so that might be something we'll receive comments on. But this is the existing ability you have where you have petroleum contamination within a Zone 2 or a Zone 2 in the adjacent protected aquifer protection district. That if there's a demonstration made that the plume is stagnant and receding, and will not be reaching the wellhead, that you can reach a permanent solution in those cases. One of the problems with the existing language is that it's worded as being only applicable to those sites where contamination is limited to oil. So that has left other sites that have other contaminants, including additives, metals, unable to use the provision. So we've changed the wording of that in terms of defining petroleum hydrocarbons in the context of this provision, and so it will also be applicable to those sites that have other contaminants that are otherwise at the levels that meet the GW1 standards.
Is that the response to the Peter Boyle?
Yeah, that is, well, the clarification is related to the Peter Boyle case. I have braces. I'm having trouble. So that's what's going on here. Just getting used to them. So we have also added a provision related to considering potential impacts to site that might be the result long-term of climate change. We've talked about this in different ways in this group, and some of the presentations that Tom Potter has done and some of the modeling he's done with the help of a Boston University student that looked at our disposal sites. Usually this relates to those that are near surface water bodies or subject to flooding. Also related to those those systems, like active remedial systems, that might be knocked out by flooding, and potential backup for those systems. So the change we're proposing, we put this in a couple of different places. One is to include this under considerations for foreseeable use of the site. The other is to add to the response action performance standard consideration of models, which would include climate models, and also to include in our list of relevant guidance where we now talk about DEP and EPA guidance, to also reference EOEEA policies, because most of the climate work and all of the kind of supporting information that's coming out is being done by the program at EOEEA. Remedial additives, this couple changes here. This very soon after we published the 2014 amendments, it was pointed out that the new provision about remedial additives near schools, daycares, and residents that was addressing the concern about volatilization was overly broad, in that it wasn't really limited to those situations that could result in, that either were the application of volatile additives or could result in volatilization. So we've narrowed that. We also have checked with our staff in terms of the presumptive approval period and how they're managing that, and determined that we could shorten that period of time. So we're proposing to shorten that from 30 to 21 days. And then there's just some more clarification about how to incorporate the plan into your submittals to request approval. The next couple slides have to do with tier classification, status reports, some relationship to temporary solutions. This is also something we, I think, spent a few meetings going into more detail here. The first change is just a clarification. In 2014, we switched from the NRS tier classification to the classification based on Tier 1 criteria, but we did not have a corresponding description of what kind of information is needed to support that classification or reclassification, and had left in place a reference to Phase 1 report. So this change is just to make that more specific to documenting the reclassification based on the Tier 1 criteria or the absence of the meeting Tier 1 criteria. There's also clarification about those reclassifications requiring public involvement. Tier classification extensions. One change is to get rid of the 45-day prior requirement that you have to come in before it expires. That has never been well understood. It's difficult to track. This simplifies it and really makes it effective when it comes in. And in some cases, it may have expired in the meantime, but the clock will be reset when it comes in. one thing we talked about is there had been confusion as to which cases tier classification had to be maintained, particularly with sites in temporary solution. One thing we had proposed is to get rid of that confusion by saying it had to be maintained in every case. But to kind of make that easier, we would tie the classification maintenance to status reports, and if the site was otherwise submitting all those other submittals on time, that it would effectively maintain the tier classification. In terms of temporary solutions and status reports, again, there was confusion about what type of temporary solution required status reports. And there were differences in terms of sites where pretty much the same kind of work was being done, but status reports weren't coming in the case of temporary solutions where they were otherwise being submitted for other sites in other phases of work. So there's this one clarification is to require the 6 months, make it clear that the 6-month status report is required for temporary solutions that are doing active O&M as it is in other cases. We talked about also requiring for temporary solution sites where they aren't doing active O&M that we would want an annual status report that indicated where the site was. This is one way to engage or re-engage, in some cases, those temporary solution sites. One discussion we had was this being overkill in some cases, particularly in those sites where really little activity is being done. There may not even be annual groundwater monitoring in those cases. So the benefit of having annual reports may not be worth the cost of doing that administratively. So as it's written now, we're proposing that it's an annual status report in those cases unless they come in with some alternative schedule up to and including every 5 years, which would correspond to the periodic evaluation that they're doing anyways in those cases. So I anticipate we'll get a lot of comment on this. I think our goals are to make it, make the work fit the situation as best we can and allow for some flexibility, but we also want some clarity in terms of what's happening at these sites, which is what we really don't have now, and some consistency. Because I think when we look at this, it's really different things are happening at different sites. Different approaches are being taken at sites that are in the same situation. And we've been kind of struggling with how to make the distinction and also establish what should be done in these cases. So, so please give it some thought as well, and I think we will probably have some additional discussion about this once we see the comments come in. Juliana?
Just one question. Sites where you're just monitoring would fall into the annual group?
If it doesn't meet the definition of active operation and monitoring, then yes. And the only case where you're just monitoring that might also be active O&M is if it's an active remedial program.
Right.
Like an M&A type program.
Okay. So that would stay in the 6 months.
Yeah. Active exposure pathway elimination measures. A lot of the changes here are to reflect the experience we've had with implementing this program since 2014. I know Brian and Dave LaPusada talked about this at the last LSPA meeting in more detail, including some of the regulatory changes, but I just highlight the general, or the key changes that are part of this. One is the current regulations talk about systems not functioning properly, and that notification should be based on that, but it really didn't give a definition of what that is. So we're moving towards defining that in terms of systems operating outside of the appropriate range in terms of the vacuum on the system. We also included the registration process as part of the regulations. We have created, instead of telemetry, the requirements for private wells that are being treated in terms of monitoring that would be done, and it involves doing the initial monitoring to show that the treatment system is working, and then establishing the appropriate frequency for maintaining that system, and then periodically reporting on that. There are also some modifications that have been made to the annual certification, and that includes also including the notice if your system's down for 30 days. That's also been included in the activity and use limitation text that goes with an item that's used as part of a permanent solution. And then there's a placeholder provision in there for transitioning these systems, something we want to explore. Transitioning perhaps to a continuous monitoring system for these systems. The department is exploring this in terms of having a setup here where we can receive this information and see how the system is operating on a continuous basis. Where our thought is that if we can get to that point for the new registrations, then we would be able to back off on all these additional requirements in terms of monitoring. I think that would probably benefit everyone. We're looking at it also not only in terms of the quality of the information we get in terms of having the continuous monitoring, but also in terms of our resources in tracking it and the need for annual certification letters and all the rest. So what's in there now is a provision that pretty much says if you establish with the department this continuous monitoring, there's a process for doing that. We have yet to set ourselves up on this end to be able to receive this, but that's something we're doing a pilot project on now and exploring. So the reg is there, giving us the ability to take advantage of it should we be able to move in that direction. Post-permit solution remedial actions, we've incorporated language related to the management of contaminated groundwater in there. The existing text is really mostly focused on remedial actions that involve managing contaminated soil. We expanded it to include both URAMs as well as RAMs as being a vehicle you can use to conduct work. And we also moved out of that section of the regs references to temporary solutions. That it has the benefit of not adding to the confusion about temporary solutions somehow being in the same category in terms of work being done beyond an endpoint. You can still obviously do a release abatement measure or a URAM at a temporary solution site, but that would be similar to doing it at a site in phase 2 or inside of the MCP process. This activity use limitations for elm apples, you're all familiar with this. We've talked about this change. It's really reflecting what we already have articulated in the elm apple guidance as our enforcement discretion position, that we would not require an activity and use limitation for an apple that's observed in wells or excavations that is less than or greater than a half inch. That is equal to or less than a half inch thickness. And the intent here is really to focus activity use limitation on those sites where we think there will be more of an issue in terms of providing notice of the ongoing presence of NAPL and the potential need to manage it. GPS coordinates, we're looking for comment. We have kind of an extended comment note about what we would see as the potential future benefits of getting GPS coordinates for all monitoring wells, and then being able to fold that information into our mapping abilities, and also make that available to all of you who are doing work. Where we put this is into the definition of monitoring well. So monitoring well now has a clause at the end that says and identified through GPS coordinates. So what the question for all of you is whether we're ready at this point to make this a requirement, whether you're doing this already in your work, how much of an adjustment this would be, and how much of a benefit you think it would be to you.
Liz, question. For GPS coordinates, are you talking about UTM, are you talking about latitude and longitude, or one or the other?
Or do you not know?
I think we're using latitude and longitude in GIS, aren't we? Or what do we use?
Well, you can use anything. I mean, as long as you identify what you're using, you can use it. But I don't know what I don't think we wrote it into the regs, but.
Yeah. Because if you download Google Earth, you get latitude and longitude. So it's not,
Yeah. I think in the early days we used to have UTM coordinates, didn't we? In like a phase 1 report, but I think we moved away from that.
Good.
Just
Julian?
one question on, have you thought already about how this data will be entered? Like, it just seems like if every time you submit a report that has groundwater data in it.
No, we haven't.
Okay. Like if it's
No, I know,
a
it's not-
tedious BWSC form thing, it's
That's right.
going to
And
be
all the
okay.
devil is in the details in terms
Yeah.
of administratively how.
Like the
how
RMRs
yeah.
are enough. Already. Like if it's 400 wells and you have to
Right.
it's got to be streamlined. But I think a lot of people already have that. I don't think the data is a big deal, but if it becomes
It's
tedious,
the task of entering it. Yeah.
right? If it or if it can be streamlined and here's an Excel table and you could upload it and that's fine. But if it's hand entered through,
It's just on the logs and
that's not.
Right. I think we would want it so that it would dump right into our database as well, so we wouldn't be handling it. Paul, do you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah, I would view this as like the first step, kind of in our progression towards taking in actual data. So this is to get people thinking that, oh, I should know where I'm taking these samples. I should know where the wells are.
Yeah.
And
people know that. Yeah.
Right. And you should know that. So it's getting used to that. We've talked about the bigger department-wide IPAS project. Which wayside clean, I don't know where this goes from. There it goes on that, but it has a good weight to it. I like it. Where and wayside cleanup is kind of lower on the list for moving into the new IPAS systems. But this is part of the preparation for doing that. Ideally, at some point in the future, we're going to have systems set up so that we can take in groundwater data. And if the future we'd like to work towards is being able to have the wells identified, be able to easily input data, sampling results for those wells, and have it searchable, people be able to look for it, so that if you're doing a property transaction over here and you want to see what the groundwater quality is around the neighborhood, that sort of thing would be easy to pull up. That's a long-term goal, but ideally that's where we should be headed.
And did you have a discussion of only focusing on groundwater and excluding other media, or do you think over time it might expand?
Well, over time it will expand. The question is how quickly do you get there? Groundwater monitoring wells are maybe the easy pickings here, the low-hanging fruit, even though it is difficult and tricky and we're pushing it. But at least you install them, you know where they are, they don't move. So we'll start there.
I noticed that I'm running a little long, so I have a few slides. I'm just going to try to do them quickly. Paul has a few as well. A couple of public involvement changes. The notice to affected individual for the presence of imminent hazards or CEP conditions. One of the changes is to require that notice be given on confirmation of the presence of the IH or the CEP condition and not tie it to doing a remedial action to address that condition. Also requiring where you're dealing with a commercial or industrial multi-unit building that this be posted and remain posted for the extent of the immediate response action. In terms of written notices that are sent to local officials, we're going to make that available to be done by email rather than through the mail. And in terms of notification exemptions, there are a few modifications to some of the existing notification exemptions, but only one new one, which is notifications related to liquefied, liquid oxygen and nitrogen. There's still a 10-pound reportable quantity for notification, but notification is not required if local officials are informed and you follow up and do what they've asked you to do. The recognition here is that there's really not much in terms of an MCP response action that makes sense with respect to these releases that dissipate upon being released.
Yes.
Paul?
You're not going to push the button?
Don't dawdle.
I was waiting for you to push the button. Okay, so as you can see, there's a lot of detail, a lot of changes in the regs. You know, maybe not many of them that are earth-shattering, but you can imagine in the kind of review and approval process, when you give somebody the entire MCP in 97 notes to reviewers, it can be a little bit intimidating, and it can take some time to work through the process and understand why we're doing each and every one of these. One of the main focuses, however, has been on PFAS, and we've talked about this, so we won't go into a lot of detail here because I'm not going to tell you what the numbers are. Because that's what everybody wants to know, what's the number? And that's one of the things that we have to be aware that it's still in the review and approval process, so until the number comes out, we don't have a number. But what I do want to emphasize here is that there is an extensive note to reviewer here. This is probably the longest note to reviewer in the package. And there are a lot of questions. We've been following along the PFAS, you know, what other states are doing. There's a range of approaches that are out there. And the note to reviewer tries to ask specific questions to help us and help all of us kind of work through what would be best and appropriate for Massachusetts, given what we know, the occurrence of these materials, et cetera, and how the MCP works. So, pay particular attention to the note to reviewers. All of the information that you give us will be very helpful, not only in the MCP standards development, but it will also feed into the process that will be going on concurrently, reviewing and potentially updating the ORS guideline in the shorter term, and then in the longer term, the comments that you submit on PFAS will be given to our water supply folks and will help them in their MCL development as well. So, and there will be public comment after that. But this is a chance to get in on the ground floor, not only on the MCP changes, but on the MCL proposal as well. Gardening. As you know, 2014, we put out the permit solution with conditions but no AUL for things like gardening, referencing best management practices for gardening. Here we try to clarify kind of how that process works, and particularly under method 3, kind of what a qualitative assessment of the gardening exposure pathway would be, and how the need to quantify that exposure would be negated by implementing and using these best management practices. So putting that in regulation so it's very clear how the process would work. The exposure point concentrations. All right. For this is a real enticement to come to the LSTA meeting in March, where Nancy Bettinger, and the one in April in the Western region, where Nancy Bettinger will go into a lot of detail about the EPCs. But a couple things that I will emphasize here to entice you to go. One is we've tried to identify types of conditions and types of sites where what we're doing now, using the arithmetic mean and the 75-10 rule, would be appropriate, and you can continue doing and thinking about it exactly the same way that you think about it now. But also identify situations and conditions and types of sites and types of conditions where using the upper confidence limit on the mean would be appropriate. And here, typically if you do work in other states, if you do work with the EPA, you know that using the 95th percentile of the upper confidence limit on the mean is the standard EPC for a lot of those risk assessments, a lot of those evaluations. So we're asking a couple things. One, where would it be appropriate to use that rather than straight arithmetic mean? And is the 95th percentile value the appropriate one, or the 90th percentile, or some other? The 87th percentile value, whichever we're going to do. But we're focusing on the 90th versus the 95th percentile. And there's discussions about hotspots and upper concentration limits, and if you could suggest some way of avoiding the use of 2 UCL acronyms, we'd listen to that too. But the bottom line is also, and I don't want to minimize this, that we're trying to retain a simple approach for simple sites, which are the majority of our sites.
A question on that before we move on. Have you incorporated some thought about sites that are already in progress and that might be considered complex sites, but they've already perhaps gone through their phase 2 and risk characterization?
The question is, have we incorporated into this concept some consideration of sites that might be considered complicated but are already kind of far along through the process? And we haven't explicitly in this, in the kind of lead time or when the regs would go into effect. That's generally how we take into account sites that are already in the process, and allowing sites to close under, some time to close under the old rules. So that's the way we typically do it. Certainly we would accept and look at comments and particularly suggestions on how to otherwise deal with it.
So right now you're just thinking it's the transition.
It's part of the normal transition.
But even for these complicated sites that may not fit that type of timeline in terms of more complex remediations, their window is likely over when the regs go with a 2-month or so. That's what you're thinking right now?
That's what we're thinking right now.
But I also don't, maybe I misheard you, I don't hear you saying all sites are going to need to use a 95th.
No,
I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Yeah, you're not, what I don't think I hear you saying is that all complex sites are going to have to go to a 95th.
So this is the problem of talking about it without the actual reg language. So one of the things that we're looking for comment, where we have language talking about it, and we're looking for comment, as you'll see when we actually are able to show you the regs, is how do we identify situations, sites, conditions that would more perfectly be addressed using the upper confidence limit on mean. So say it is a gross simplification to say simple sites versus complex sites. So that's one of the things to look at, is it really is, what do you know, what do we know about the distribution of the chemicals and the concentrations of the chemicals at the site, how, to use the same words, how confident do you feel about the mean and the data quality and the representativeness of the information that you have, all of which kind of goes into it. And which is why we're specifically asking for comments on kind of how you identify those conditions, as well as kind of the road, use upper confidence limit on the versus the outer confidence. We've talked about including a hierarchy of toxicity. If you're doing a method 3 risk characterization, as you know, there's some situations where MassDEP publishes toxicity values, and having evaluated those chemicals and identified toxicity values that we would use in developing standards and doing risk assessment, we do have a strong belief that those are the values that should be used in 2188 MCP risk assessments. So we're proposing to list toxicity values, and those would be a limited list on those chemicals for which we have developed them, and that may be in the absence of an EPA number, or it may be because DEP has reviewed and determined that something different would be appropriate. So those that short list would include things like perchlorate, MTBE, PCE, PFAS, theoretically. And then also otherwise a list of potential sources for toxicity information with a listed preference with justification, documentation, etc. Imminent hazards, we had talked about eliminating kind of the quantitative assessment of carcinogens for imminent hazards, and had kind of moved away from that. What we are doing in terms for imminent hazards, one is the list of levels in soil that could potentially pose an imminent hazard and which require 2-hour notification are being updated to reflect new toxicity values and the 2014 methodology. The kind of bigger thing is the comparison to the risk limits, whether it's a hazard index or excess lifetime cancer risk. The terminology has been changed from is greater than to is equal to or greater than, and that eliminates the ongoing and long-running discussion about the appropriateness of rounding to one significant figure for imminent hazards only. The language, it stays the same for the long-term risk, which reflects, in our belief, the fact that when you're making imminent hazard decisions, you're usually doing it based on limited data, limited information early on in the process, and have to make decisions very quickly. And in that context, discussions about whether one significant figure is appropriate to do it, and whether if you come up with a hazard index of 1.45, whether that is in fact an imminent hazard because it looks to be greater than 1, but if you actually use the correct figure, it runs down to 1 and thus isn't an imminent hazard. That's not the sort of discussion that you should be having when you're thinking about short-term measures to address an imminent hazard. That's fine if you're looking at long-term risk, long-term exposure, and whether a site poses a permanent solution, and you have a lot more information, you adequately characterize the site, and you're looking at that point. So that's why we changed the language in one location, but not in the other, and we think that that will, for most sites in most situations, it will not make that much of a difference. For the sites where that is an issue, those discussions will no longer be necessary.
And so there aren't any changes relating to carcinogens?
No. The discussions that we had a meeting dedicated to the question of carcinogen risk. We played with some of the language, and it turned out to be a small number of sites, a small number of situations, and the complexity of the changes did not appear to be worth actually changing.
So it's still just it's 5 years? So.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Method 1 standard updates, we're updating a number of them. You'll see them. There'll be spreadsheets. There'll be documentation for doing that. We've added a few new hazardous materials. PFAS. The majority of the changes are small. As you see here, groundwater standards, 12 of 360 change. Some go up, and in this context, up means greater values If you think of things being more or less stringent, it would be less stringent. I prefer thinking of it, it's the same risk level, but you have a higher number, it becomes easier to meet, if you want to put it that way. And the big ones, I think, other than PFAS, I think the big changes would be of interest would be reflecting the new toxicity values for the pHs, benzoate hydrogen, and that kind of ripples through the fact of that.
PCE as well?
Well, yeah, PCE, which we, yes.
What happened to benzoate pyrene?
It became less toxic.
Wow.
Good. Yay.
Suddenly.
It's amazing.
And I mean, one of the things I would emphasize with that, I mean, we feel very comfortable having numbers go up to reflect new information and new interpretation of data. And because we also feel that if new information comes down, which indicates that numbers should be more stringent, we're comfortable doing that as well. And you have to be comfortable doing both and following the numbers. And in the case of a very common contaminant, which has effects on other pHs, the benzoate pyrene, the new toxicity values indicates that we should be less concerned about the toxicity.
Sounds very sciencey.
I know.
I love it.
Yeah. And explicitly addressing waste deposits. This is just to make clear that if you have waste deposits, sitting there, manufactured gas plant waste being one of them, in soil, that there must be a way of addressing them and quantifying the exposure and quantifying the risk associated with them. And we have run into some situations where people have been confused about how to do it, because you look at it and you say, well, it's not soil, it's tarry, gunky stuff. So the soil standards don't apply, and nobody would touch the material, so really there's no exposure. So there's no risk. And there must be actually a way of looking at that and addressing the risk in a consistent way. So we're trying to clarify that as well. And I believe that's it for me.